Genocide. It's one of the heaviest, most charged words we have in international law. Today, we're going to walk through a detailed rebuttal that takes on this very accusation in the context of Gaza. But here's the thing. It tries to do it not with opinion, but with hard data and historical comparisons. So let's dive in and see how this argument is actually constructed. All right, here's our roadmap. We're going to break down the author's argument in 5 steps. First, what exactly is the accusation on the table? Then, we'll get into the all-important question of intent. After that, we'll pull back and look at the data from other major wars before zooming right in on a key metric, casualty ratios. And finally, we'll look at what the author calls a double standard. So let's start at the beginning. What is the specific claim that the author of this piece, Shmuel Sperling, is actually responding to? Well, it all kicks off with one very powerful statement. And there it is. This is the quote that really serves as the catalyst for this whole rebuttal. The source paper is directly engaging with Professor Amos Goldberg, who argues that the outcome we're seeing in Gaza is, in his words, undoubtedly genocidal. Okay, so right away, the author zeroes in on a really critical piece of the legal definition of genocide, the idea that it can apply to destroying just part of a group. This little detail is absolutely key because it's the foundation of the argument he's about to try and dismantle. And this brings us to the author's first major counterpoint. He basically says, hold on a second. If you interpret it that way, things get really tricky. He poses this question. If killing enemy fighters, who are by definition part of a larger national group, counts as genocide, couldn't you slap that label on almost any act of war? And that question leads us straight to the absolute core of the legal definition, intent. The author argues that deliberate destruction is everything. He says you have to prove that was the goal, and he lays out several pieces of evidence that he believes show it wasn't. So here's the evidence he puts forward to argue against intent. He points to the big picture, like the fact that the Palestinian population has grown significantly over the last few decades. But then he brings it to the current conflict, citing things like evacuation warnings and the transfer of food and fuel, actions he claims are just fundamentally at odds with the goal of total annihilation. The paper then really frames the conflict as these two opposing strategies clashing. On one side, you have the author's take on Hamas's strategy, embedding with civilians, where every civilian death becomes a propaganda tool. And on the other side, he presents Israel's stated goal, which is to destroy Hamas as a military force while making efforts to spare civilians. Now, you might be thinking, what about the public anger in Israel? The author tackles that head-on. He doesn't deny that the anger is real and intense, but he frames it as a very human, understandable reaction to the horrors of October 7th, not as evidence of some pre-planned, state-level genocidal intent. Okay, so after making his case against intent, the author makes a really sharp pivot. He moves away from analyzing words and stated goals and shifts into the world of cold, hard numbers, trying to place this conflict into a much broader historical context. And to really anchor this entire section, he leans on this quote from a pretty heavy hitter, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley. Milley's take is that, from a military history perspective, the casualty numbers in Gaza, while tragic, are not an outlier. To back that up, the author brings in a few stark examples. First, from World War II. During the Normandy invasion to liberate France, U.S. forces were reportedly responsible for the deaths of 12,000 French civilians. In that same war, he points to the Allied bombing of Dresden in Germany, which led to an estimated 30,000 civilian deaths in just one city. And then, bringing it to a more modern conflict, he cites the Iraq War, where some sources estimate around 150,000 innocent civilians were killed over a 5-year span. So when you see those numbers laid out like this, the author's point becomes really clear. He's arguing that these historical events, with these massive civilian death tolls, were seen as tragic consequences of war, but they weren't called genocide. And this is the precedent he's using for his comparison. So, building on that big picture history, the author then drills down into a really specific metric, one that military analysts say is crucial for understanding modern urban warfare. And that's the ratio of combatants killed to civilians killed. For this, the paper leans heavily on an estimate from John Spencer, who is the chair of urban warfare studies at West Point. His analysis suggests that for every one enemy fighter killed in Gaza, somewhere between 1.5 to 2 civilians have been killed. And this bar chart really visualizes that comparison for us. On the left, you've got the battle for Mosul in Iraq. There, for every one combatant killed, 2.5 civilians were killed. And on the right, you have the estimate for Gaza, which, according to this expert, is actually significantly lower, around 1.5 civilians per combatant. So the huge takeaway the author wants you to have from this data is this. The combatant-to-civilian casualty ratio in Gaza, while awful, is not only something we've seen before, but it's potentially lower than what we've seen in other recent urban battles fought by Western armies. Okay, so this naturally leads to a big question. If the data and the ratios are, as the author claims, within historical norms for this kind of fighting, then why is the word genocide being used so prominently? This brings us to the final part of his argument, where he claims Israel is being judged by a completely different standard. To try and make this case, he draws a direct and pretty provocative comparison between the 9/11 attacks and the October 7th attacks. He argues that when you adjust for the size of the population, October 7th was a much larger-scale massacre, and that it involved atrocities and the occupation of territory that set it apart from 9/11. And in his view, this justifies the massive military response. So the author's whole double standard claim really boils down to these 3 points. He asks why so many people shouting genocide today were silent during the Iraq War, which he claims wasn't a response to an existential threat. And he contrasts that with Israel's situation, fighting a group right on its own border that it considers a direct threat to its existence. And so, to wrap it all up, the author's final conclusion is this. When you look at the stated intent, the historical data, and the casualty ratios, Israel's goal isn't the annihilation of a people. Instead, it's a very specific military objective: destroy Hamas and bring the hostages home. So we've just walked through one author's very detailed, data-driven case, and it really leaves us with a tough question to think about. When we try to use data from past wars to make sense of a conflict happening right now, how do we decide what context is absolutely essential for a fair comparison? And what's just noise?